employers are struggling to manage this costly illness. But the SA Federation for Mental Health says employers must understand the rights of their workers to effectively address this issue. Well, Nicole Breen from the group joins us this morning to talk about back to work. Nicole, good morning, and thanks for your time. What do we normally see happening at this time of year for those who've had a bit of a break, maybe managed to come down from the stresses of the workplace last year? What is the conversation that they're probably having with themselves as they get back to work this week, or maybe next week?
Well, coming back to work is a considerable adjustment, in terms of how you spend your time, in terms of, the different stresses and pressures that you have, in terms of how you may have left things last year, if there was a lot of stress and pressure that remained sort of left over, new challenges that might arise, in the coming year, and so on. So there's going to be a lot going through the heads of employees as they come back to the office.
What's the sort of general state of mind that we find at this time? Do we see that people get back to work only to stay away for another couple of days, or people genuinely get back and actually feel like I actually can't cope come January when I have to go back to this place? And of course it also depends on whether they actually like their work, I suppose.
Yes, that's quite correct. It depends entirely on a number of factors, actually. So it could depend on the person's overall mental state, how the person coped with the festive season, the nature of the work that the person does, and so forth.
And the financial strain, I suppose, they're facing as they get back to work in January is what we call it.
Right.
How big a part does that play? Is, sort of what you've spent over the holidays, what you're getting back to, and what you've got to basically put in now, especially those who work in areas where it's commission-based, I suppose, as well, that kind of work.
Well, yes, that is very difficult and definitely places a strain on people. You look at the way that people live during December. Every day becomes a Friday night, and people spend recklessly on things like gifts, on lavish parties, on so-called keeping up the Joneses, and then they're faced with this reality in January where they have to go back to their lives, which they've very often not been able to adequately budget for. And this can naturally cause a great deal of stress and worry in their lives.
Are we seeing, there's been a lot more awareness in recent years about mental health in the workplace, lots of calls to employers to recognize this, make amends for it, have some understanding. As we start 2019, are we seeing that employers, whether it's corporate, whether it's government, that they are more mindful of this? And are employees and employers aware of their rights when it comes to what happens if you have a worker who is battling with something and trying to work?
Well, what we're seeing is more employers setting up or putting in place corporate wellness programs, creating safe spaces for employees to discuss their mental health issues, or employing reasonable accommodation mechanisms in the event that an employee's mental health issues become disabling. So we are seeing that, but nonetheless, mental health issues still remain relatively unknown to employers, who very often do not take them into account.
So I'm reading here, and there's a question here that says, what are the employer's rights? And an employer is not required to accommodate an employee with a disability, it says, as this would impose an unjustified hardship on the employer's business. How do we view that?
No. According to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, an employer ought to implement what is known as reasonable accommodation in the event that an employee's condition becomes disabling, provided that the accommodation isn't unjust or does not place unjustifiable hardship on the employer. So what that situation denotes is instances where where provision is made for a conducive environment to be created for an employee that does not compromise the employer, but allows for the employee to do their work effectively and efficiently.
Nicole, are we coming to a point where, when you get to that job interview or somebody applies for a job, that right at the start, that we have those assessments that are done, maybe mental health assessments, psychological assessments, to see whether that person is meant for that job and meant for that environment? Do we know, firstly, if that happens anywhere? And would that be something that we should be looking at?
I've heard of things like psychometry being employed in the interview process of people. It is, it is questionable whether those things should be done, whether, how invasive it is or how effective it is. But it is nonetheless a tool that is sometimes used.
And what is the obligation of the employer when you recognize, or when you've got a diagnosis, when your worker comes to you and says, listen, boss, this is what I've done the assessments, I've been to psychologists, psychiatrists, this is what they say I'm suffering with. How far is there an obligation on the employer's part to actually accommodate that worker, and how far does that extend?
Well, like I said, accommodation must always be reasonable in nature. So it has to be a balanced approach that is taken for both the employer and the employee. So examples of reasonable accommodation might include things like allowing the employee to go to doctor's appointments or to collect medication, or incrementally increasing the workload of an employee when they return from sick leave, or flexible working hours, and so on. Like I've said, the objective is not to obtain a diminished outcome. The objective is simply to create that environment that is conducive for an employee with a disability to do their work.
I think it's more and more we have to have the discussion, and both sides having to state where they stand on the issue. Thank you very much for that explanation, and good luck to those who are at their first week of work or heading there next week as well. That's Nicole Breen. She's from the South African Federation for Mental Health.